This week's scheduled talks will be vital to stave off a looming famine in South Sudan. UNICEF says food scarcity brought on by the civil war has already affected some 4 million South Sudanese. Relief organizations say food stocks are running low, and the start of the rainy season has dashed hopes that farmers could plant enough crops to feed themselves. Joining us now is Udo Janz. He's the director of the UN Refugee Agency's New York office. Udo Janz, thanks for joining us. We heard the
Thank you for having me.
UN Security Council saying that the food crisis in South Sudan is the worst in the world. How bad is it, and what is being done to get food to people?
Your introduction has said it all already. The rainy season that is on us is, of course, only compounding the issue. You have to picture 1 million plus people displaced in a country, almost 100,000 who have sought shelter in United Nations compounds, which really is an unprecedented phenomenon. With the rains on us, we are forced to airdrop food assistance to people, and we still have 1.4 million people to reach whom we deem in need of urgent humanitarian assistance before the end of the year. So that gives you an idea of the scale, of the magnitude that we are grappling with at the moment.
Right, as you point out, there are food shortages, but that is being aggravated by the displacement of people, up to 1 million, as you've just mentioned. I mean, how serious is that?
Well, it is not very often that one can over-dramatize a situation to the extent that famine is looming on the horizon, given that the agricultural season has been lost. People are not able to go back to their lands in safety and dignity, to live on their own lands and plant their crops. Hence, what is in front of us is really the worst case scenario, and we can only hope that before long the world actually heeds our appeal for urgent assistance. We just revised our appeal on the basis of forecasts of people displaced. We are now talking 1.5 million people displaced, over 1 million inside the country, and close to 500,000 in the neighboring countries who have kept their borders open and accommodated those who have managed to flee across the border. But clearly the challenge is daunting, and on top of that we had an outbreak of cholera, which has already affected over 5,000 people, and the latest figures that I have received point to already 115 deaths in the previous couple of weeks.
Now, it's a big country, it's the size of France, it has very few paved roads. So on the one hand, there are food shortages, but what are the challenges that you face getting food to people in a country like this?
Logistics are just unbelievable. To try and reach the outlying areas, even though we have a substantial field presence, also in remote locations, really requires also for the security of those convoys, United Nations peacekeeping forces to accompany convoys where needed, because the roads clearly are not safe apart from the weather conditions, and hence the measure of last resort, which really is what food aid out of an airdrop dropped from a plane is all about. There is risks associated with that. There is also less monitoring that you can do, and obviously it is one of the most expensive ways to deliver food aid to people who are starving.
Now, you also have about 150,000 people who fled to Ethiopia. There's about 250,000 people who fled to eastern Chad. What do we know about the fate of those people?
Indeed. Well, I think the first port of call for those people is to seek protection. Protection that their own government, unfortunately, cannot provide them any longer with, and forces them into exile. Now, we are fortunate to see neighboring countries opening their borders and keeping them open in order to provide that sort of safe haven, and this is where UNHCR obviously comes in our what we see as a threefold problem: to assist in the first place as many of the internally displaced as possible within the country. Secondly, all those who have managed to seek protection and found protection in the neighboring countries. And thirdly, don't forget there are another 240,000 refugees from elsewhere inside South Sudan that also need to be protected and need to be fed and provided with the necessary bare bones minimum of humanitarian assistance that all people deserve.
Right, you mentioned a moment ago that there is an urgent need for more assistance for the people of South Sudan. What kind of response has the UN been getting from that appeal?
The response leaves much to be desired given the various crises around the world at this time. When you look at what is happening in and around the Syria situation, the Central African Republic, now South Sudan, the needs are ever increasing. Old conflicts never seem to die, and new conflicts are adding to the problem. Hence, our appeal had to be revised just earlier this month to 658 million needed before the end of this year, and it is to date only 24% funded. That gives you an idea of the challenge ahead of us. There is no way that UNHCR or its partners in the UN and outside, among the non-governmental organizations with whom we partner to deliver essential humanitarian assistance, can cope with the lack of funding that does not allow the procurement of the basic assistance items that we need to deliver.
And you also mentioned earlier that there's been a cholera outbreak. The South Sudanese Ministry of Health says something like 150,000 people have been affected by this. How is that crisis being tackled right now?
Well, I think our experts in the UN and beyond, whether it's the Médecins Sans Frontières of this world or the WHO, are working flat out to try and contain the cholera epidemic before it gets completely out of hand. But given the cramped conditions in which people are residing in IDP camps, internally displaced camps, or even inside UN compounds in the rainy season, this is really testing everybody's expertise to try and contain the virus before it affects further people.
And I guess something else that must be testing everybody's patience is the fact that the conflict has not been resolved. Are you hopeful that it will be resolved soon?
Now, this is the biggest tragedy of all for a country where we all had very high hopes, not least the population of South Sudan itself. The euphoria that accompanied the independence celebrations just 3 years ago. And when we see what has happened in the meantime, this is really one of the greatest tragedies of our times. More than 15% perhaps of the population has now been displaced. Further bad news are looming on the horizon. What does it take for the two leaders to bury their differences and finally come together in a unity government that develops the country and brings those assistance needs to its own people that they so much deserve, and before it gets even worse than it is already? I think those two leaders deserve every support that they can get in order to reach that agreement, which is what a lot of friends of South Sudan are working on. But it is ultimately their differences that they have to bury and agree on a common way forward.
Udo Janz, thanks for joining us, sir.